In today's complex environment, almost every major project, from mining to transmission lines, is contentious. Hi, my name is Ali Mears.
And I'm Bing Giroux.
Welcome to Primary Risk, where each month we speak with the people behind the projects shaping our world.
We'll be hosting candid conversations and hearing from industry leaders, political figures, engineers, and project proponents. We'll be exploring the soft issue risks, challenges, and solutions, and behind-the-scenes stories of what it took to get these complex projects across the finish line. Or not.
Rebecca Scott is a senior communications leader with over 20 years' experience across the public and private sectors, specializing in strategic communications, media relations, and reputation management in complex, regulated environments. She's spent time in journalism, politics, government, consulting, and major project development, bringing a well-rounded and practical perspective to communication strategy and execution. Rebecca is currently Senior Director of Communications and Public Engagement at Western LNG, working to bring the Ksi Lisims LNG and PRGT projects to construction. Thanks for coming on today, Rebecca.
Thank you, Ali.
So glad to have you here. It's been a while since we worked together at Woodfibre LNG.
Yes.
Those were the days. It's been
Lots
exciting.
of memories.
Yeah, good and bad.
Only good. What are you talking
only
about?
Positive. Only
Remember the
positive.
flashbacks.
Yeah. We'll not dive in.
Trauma.
Well, exactly. So we always start by talking more about our guests. So we'd actually love to start, Rebecca, by talking a bit more about you and how did you go from working in journalism to eventually transitioning into major projects?
Yeah, I don't think that I would have planned this path for myself. And if I could go back in time, I would be perplexed by where I am now. But I can trace it back to my early days in journalism, and it was the early aughties. And climate change was becoming a really hot topic. It was still back in the day when, as a journalist, I was seeking balance by finding, the people who didn't believe climate change was real. That's how long ago it was. I got fascinated with climate change, and I got, in particular, fascinated by local responses and solutions, pragmatic and implementable solutions, not just people chaining themselves to trees, but, what is actually going to happen? What is the science and the technology that's going to evolve to help us address this problem? So I ended up covering that throughout my career as a journalist, but I produced documentary series. And when I moved over to CKNW, Bill Good and I worked extensively on climate change as a sort of recurring theme on our show. And so, when I found myself kind of suddenly working in Christy Clark's office and helping her to manage media relations.
How did that happen? So you went to school,
Yeah.
You started working in journalism, and then you
Hang
went
with Bill
to...
Good and Christy Clark called you up?
Well,
She had been on the show.
I sat next to Christy at CKNW because she was a host.
Yeah.
And so we got to know each other over, I think it was 4 years that we were there together. And she started a little bit before I did at CKNW. And I remember her asking, Rebecca, do you think I should run for leader? How do you think this would impact my family? And I said, you'll be the boss. You can manage your own calendar. Go for it, right? And I remember being there and producing the show of, the night that she was elected, and sitting with Vaughn Palmer and Keith Baldry and Bill Good and watching, her become premier, this person who we knew so well and had been our colleague. And around the same time, my husband, well, at the time my fiance had moved to Victoria, and I was hoping to get to Victoria as well so we could live together.
That's
and yeah, it's sort of,
We
sort
love
of part
Steven.
of the deal.
I get it.
And Christy was like, come on, come and help me out. And that's how that all came about. But I was there. I remember the day in her office, being there when they sort of slapped one of these down on the desk, and it said, LNG strategy. And it was like, here it is. This is our policy. This is our government's policy. And I didn't know what LNG was. Liquefied.
Nobody knew.
Nobody knew. I still think not very many people do, but I didn't know what it was. But really, I was just captured by the opportunity of it. Not just from an economic standpoint, but from a climate standpoint. And that old fascination kind of lit a fire in me. And I've been working on and off in LNG ever since. So that was like 2012. So yeah, quite a while. 3 projects now.
Wow.
Excellent. Well, we were, that's some of our experience as well. So transition. So working in the Premier's office is, we say public sector. I think the public sort of thinks it's public sector, but it's not really public sector. It's political sector, right?
It is.
So transition from political sector, private sector. What's the difference?
Ooh, I mean, so I will say for myself, I've never been a big fan of a bureaucracy. I'm a scrappy startup kind of a girl.
That is very accurate.
Thank you. In fact, like one of the reasons I left wood fiber was because I felt like it was becoming too big. It was getting into construction and starting to feel bureaucratic. And I thought, you know what, maybe this is the time to go. But I would say, public to private, big differences. I think it tends to be process, and it kind of depends. When you say it sort of depends on the size and the kind of direction of the private sector company. Like at Salism's LNG, we're very informal, very flat, very scrappy, as I would say. But there are other private companies that might be heavily bureaucratic and way more along the lines of a public sector organization. But, I think one thing that we all have in common, and this is sort of what I deal with every day, is we live in our little bubbles of understanding. And even the most informed members of society don't really know to the same detail that you would know what you're up to. And I think misunderstandings start there. And misunderstandings start with the assumption that the person sitting across the table from you understands what you're trying to do and trying to achieve, and that the private sector company sitting down with a deputy minister knows what that guy does. There was this great story that I was told a few years ago. I won't name any names, but it was a consultant who was telling me a story about a client who said, "Wow, they were coming out of a meeting with a deputy minister. Wow, that deputy minister is great. Do you think they have a shot at becoming minister someday?" And that makes the people who know what a deputy minister is smile, because that's kind of the top level of the bureaucracy. You can't move from being a deputy minister to being a minister. A minister is elected, but plenty of people don't know that, right? Yeah. Plenty of people. When I came into government, I didn't know what a ministerial assistant meant. I had to learn that through being there. I didn't know which ministry to direct question to. That was trial and error and annoying a lot of my colleagues when I was working there. So I think that's the biggest problem that we have, is we don't start from zero in our conversations, and we don't want to look stupid. So we don't ask the basic questions that help us frame where we're at, what conversations we need to have, how we align what we're trying to achieve together. And that leads to the misunderstandings and at worst conflict.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we definitely see that. And I think in general, there's just maybe a little bit less interest in politics and understanding in Canada. I think there's so much media coming at you all the time, so much government speak coming at you all the time, that sometimes it's hard to digest everything and to have an interest in digging deeper on it. I'd love to reflect a bit on your time at Woodfibre, because it was your first private sector major projects job. Obviously, you'd worked in-house. Yeah. You had worked quite extensively on the LNG file under Christy Clark in the Premier's office. But when you came into Woodfibre, can you tell us about some of your lessons learned and your experience leading communications through EA amendment periods in-house with Woodfibre, and what your kind of key takeaways were?
Oh boy. Yeah. I mean, I was brand new to it, right? Like going back to not understanding anything. I remember my boss at the time, Tessa Gill, drawing a picture on a piece of paper to illustrate what an LNG facility did and how it worked. Brilliant way to learn, by the way. I knew nothing, but it was a quick learning curve, and I had people like you, Ali, and you too, Bing. We crossed paths very briefly to help me along. I think what I learned and what I still think about when I think about my time at Woodfibre is it's that really delicate period where you're past the big heavy lift of an environmental approval, but you're not quite at construction yet. And you've got this kind of void where it might look to the outside like not a lot's going on, but the duck is paddling furiously under the water, and there's commercial agreements being made and lots of little pieces falling into place. But there's nothing to say. There's nothing new to say. And I think that was really the theme of my time at Woodfibre, was how to keep the public and our stakeholders engaged when we had nothing new to report to them. And then plop right down into the middle of that, COVID. So, we can no longer, Allie's not going into Squamish to talk to people.
I just fully left the company at that point. So
peace out. Yeah. I mean, it was so difficult. And so, I remember one time one of the project opponents put out a tweet saying, they've packed up, they've left British Columbia, we went to their offices and they're all dark. Well, we just moved across the street. We hadn't packed up, obviously. So, it was really trying to keep those relationships going, because a project can pause, but you can't pause the relationships that you need to execute that project.
It's such a good point, Rebecca. I think it's a missed opportunity and a missed window that a lot of major projects don't think about, is that post-EA pre-construction. It's not glamorous. You're right. There's very little to report on to the public. There's very little to keep people engaged, but it is so important because you're tying up some of the most important commercial agreements. Yep. You're going through amendments because the EA is so specific, and you're oftentimes having to change things as you move engineering from 30% to 100%. And to get all of your contracts lined up, it's such a tough time. So it was probably a great experience.
And the danger of those relationships atrophying.
Absolutely.
Totally.
Absolutely. And, even for the projects, even for a company that might be developing a project that does seem to be, and this is not Woodfibre, but this, a project that might seem to be starting to wither on the vine and maybe isn't going to work out. You don't know what's coming down the road. You want to keep those relationships alive no matter what. And it's one good thing that I thought, because when I was a consultant, I worked for Pacific Northwest LNG. And one of the things that they really cared about was they didn't just close their doors and turn off the lights and say, see you later. They were very deliberate about making sure that relationships were wrapped up positively, that they were, being upfront about talking to the stakeholders about what was happening. And I thought they did that very well. But yeah, I mean, you have to keep those relationships positive, and you have to at least keep them alive, keep the ventilator going, and make sure that people know that you're there, that you're still working hard, that you're working towards the same goal. So it's not easy to do. Sometimes being quiet in communications is the harder task.
Yeah, when not to speak.
When not to
or
speak.
When
you can't. Or when you can't. Yeah. That's a real, I say that all the time at work. It'd be a lot easier to just tell everybody, every little thing that's going on. But for many reasons, most of them legal, you can't do that. Some of them strategic.
It's always a disadvantage, and we've got to move on here, but it's always a disadvantage as the proponent. There's only so many things you can say. There are legal restrictions on what you can say. You can only speak the truth because of markets and investors.
Yeah.
You can't say anything. And you're up against, oftentimes, your detractors can say anything. Yeah, your office is closed and you move back to Singapore.
No, exactly right, Bing. And for Solisms, having, for the 4 years that we were in the environmental assessment process, we were actually quite deliberate about keeping our public communications to minimum. And that wasn't because we didn't want to communicate. It was because we were a player in somebody else's process. We were just a proponent. It's the British Columbia government that was in charge of ushering the process along. And it wasn't really our role to take a lead at that point, because, they set the rules for how we were supposed to engage and, what we're supposed to disclose. So we wanted to abide by those rules.
So let's jump to Silisms. Let's talk about how, so again, history here. So not everybody who's listening is familiar with all of British Columbia. So large-scale LNG project proposed by the Nisga'a and some of its partners in northwest BC, up north, close to Alaska, for those that don't know the geography. How did it come to be? I do know Nisga'a were pushing for a project over a decade ago, back to the first sort of round of big LNG excitement in BC.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That's exactly where it started. So, 2012, and there's this sort of first generation of British Columbia LNG. 20 projects are proposed. And the Niska at the time had been working for the previous 10 years to figure out what they wanted to do with their treaty lands. They were the first modern treaty nation in British Columbia. They have full ownership over their lands. What are they going to do with it? How are they going to bring their vision of independence to life? So they had been thinking about that, and they knew they had deep water ports close to Prince Rupert, and they saw all these LNG proposals nearby and thought this could be a path for us. So they took time to find a site, to talk to their citizens, and then went out looking for partners to help them get this thing going. And they were connected through relationships with Rockies LNG, which is a consortium of natural gas producers in Calgary, and also with Western LNG, which was at the time, I think, like a startup out of Houston.
But it's interesting that because that was the first round, 15 years now, and they sort of kept it alive because other than wood fiber and LNG Canada, everybody else pulled out of Dodge.
Yeah. And you know what I think is interesting about that, with the exception of LNG Canada and Cedar to an extent, what wood fiber and Silisms have in common is the proponents are small private companies, relatively small. I mean, Pacific Cambrian or Pacific Energy
$20
is not
billion
super
is
small.
small.
The biggest company you've never heard of.
But it's one guy, right? I mean, at the end of the day, it's chairman. Chairman makes the decisions.
Yeah,
so I think these types of companies are able to make decisions to hang in there. The Niska were also, I think, very, very deliberate with their choice of their partners. When they met with Davis, the CEO of Western LNG, tells a great story about sitting down with the CEO of the Niska Nation, and he's pitching the CEO of the nation about why he's a great guy to help him build this project, and the CEO of the Niska Nation is pitching Davis on why the Niska is a great partner for them, and they finally looked at each other and said, like, I feel like we're gonna do this, right? Like I feel like this is a good fit. And what it came down to at the end of the day was the Niska hearing Davis say, how do you want to build an LNG facility? Like, we have a blank page here. How do you want to do this? What are the values that you want to apply to this project? And that's the foundation of making a good project with good bones that can get through an extensive brand new EA process, get through commercial requirements, and get to the point where we're at now.
That's such an important lesson, and off script here a little bit, because it's something we talk about a lot here. Is certainly in British Columbia, but I think in Canada, and I think it applies to sort of any OECD nation, or even perhaps even beyond that. Like, people have got to get around bringing baked projects to the people on whose lands those projects are going to take place. You've got to come up sort of, like you said, the blank. I'd like to build an LNG facility somewhere here. I'm not going to tell you how big it is or what color it is. Can we talk about how it might happen, as opposed to, here it is, how do you like it so far?
Here's our model, let's make it work. Instead, this project, and I think the reason why it's been so successful, is what are the requirements not even what are the current requirements to get a project through regulatory, but what do we think they might be in a few years? Mm-hmm. So that's where net zero came from, was, this government at some point is going to require us to be net zero. Let's make this project net zero. The Niska Nation wanted it to be net zero. Let's do it, right? Let's not ask questions about it. Let's just make it happen. So let's make it floating. There's tons of commercial reasons to do it, tons of construction risk that you can eliminate by building a floating LNG. It's sort of becoming a popular way to build LNG now. But even more importantly, it reduces land impacts by like 90%. So, that suits the Niska Nation as well. And that also helps us get through a regulatory process. So those are those good bones, right? Mm-hmm. Get a project that has the fundamentals, talk to the neighbors and nations and communities about what they want and don't want, and build it that way. Don't bring in a like one size fits all plan and expect it to work.
Now, in order for it to work with the Niska as their partners, which sounds like a great relationship between Western and Niska, you need to get gas to the coast.
Yeah.
So I want to touch a little bit on PRGT, and your response to this, I think, will be interesting for our listeners to hear. What are the primary risks facing that pipe that's coming from the Montney down to the coast, where the really solid relationship with Niska and the proponent exists?
So when I first joined the company,
Which
we were
was?
still 2022. We were still in the beginning of the EA process, and we had the choice between two already approved pipelines. One was an Enbridge pipeline, and one was
Yeah,
a
that's right,
TC
that's right,
Energy
yeah.
pipeline. And so there was an advantage there. A lot of risk had already been managed in that, especially in our choice of
And
PRGT.
did they both have their
They
certificates?
both had their certificates. So the choice at the end of the day was TC's pipeline, PRGT, which part of the reason for that was it had made huge advancements in their conversations and negotiations and project agreements with nations. So they were way ahead of the game. So that eliminated a lot of the risk, but it introduced a new element of risk because the project had been paused in 2016 when the Pacific Northwest LNG project was scrapped. And because it was paused, we had to pick up those conversations. You remember what we talked about? You cannot pause a relationship,
They had
right?
atrophied a little.
Yes. So, and times had changed, and CGL had been built through, and TMX had been built through. And so all of a sudden, there's this totally new environment and context that the nations are approaching these conversations from. And so what we did was we're very upfront from the get-go that with the Niska Nation, as a leader, a co-owner of the project, we plan to do this differently. It was going to be built on learnings from previous projects. It was going to include equity opportunities for every single right-of-way nation that wanted it. We were going to, even if a nation already had an agreement, we were going to work with them to update it to make sure that it was modernized for today, that it took into account, capacity for business, new business opportunities. Because when the agreement was signed before, a nation might not have known that they were really good at managing camps. But post CGL, post TMX, they knew this. So great. Do you want to manage camps? We're putting you down for camps, or heavy, machinery operation, or whatever, that particular procurement angle is for the nation. So we were able to say to them, we're going to do this differently. We're going to learn from the past, involve you from the get-go, especially in those modernized agreements. And you can expect with the Niska Nation on board that this is going to be built adhering to your values.
Excellent. Well, it's funny how the lesson we just talked about, this atrophying, how that suddenly became the main challenge again. And what is this podcast for? We talk about risk. Like, commodity cycles come and go. Your project may not move, as we're talking about wood fiber. Might not move at the speed you want it to.
Yeah.
Windows will open when it's time to build and when it's not time to build. And if you don't keep all your sort of social license, your subjective risk, the people warm, it's almost like all that other technical work doesn't count.
We hope by the time we're into construction, we're going to have agreements with every single nation along the route. We already have most of them, but we have a few more to add.
We wish you the best of luck with that. As a firm that spends a lot of time, as you know, in that space, there's always a couple that are tough to get across the line, but they're also usually the most meaningful. So acknowledge that and acknowledge your team. You and Tom and others are working really hard on that. I have to ask you about communications, since you're the communications professional on this project and others. This project is really at the intersection of Indigenous leadership, electrification infrastructure, given you're going to be net zero, global energy demand. How do you, as a communications professional in a leadership role on this project, Rebecca, how do you communicate all of these very different policy narratives that are coming up? We talk about UNDRIP and other things layered right now in the province. How are you communicating that out to not only Niska Nation as your partner and working with them on that narrative, but to the nations along PRGT and others?
Yeah. Well, back to me for a second. I think, you asked me earlier what led me to be interested in a natural resource project. Part of it is this. This is a eminently newsworthy project, and I don't think as a former journalist I could do anything that wasn't newsworthy. And so you're right. It combines all kinds of different, top of mind narratives together in one project. I appreciate that about it. It makes my job a little bit easier, actually.
And maybe a little more fun.
And a lot more fun. But I would say I don't separate them out, though, Ali. I think we operate in the environment that we operate in, and the environment in a big way informs who we are and what we're about and what we can offer. And so right now, what I do is I talk to different audiences with a different emphasis. So that's the communication strategy. So I'm not going over to the Niska Nation and talking about energy security. They think it's interesting, but what they want to know about is they want to know about their own economic independence. They want to know about, how does this project make it easier for my nephew to get a job, or, my cousin's business to get some work. So, knowing that that's what they want to hear, but it does still link into that central theme. When we're talking to government or, to Canadians even at large, talking about economic security, talking about energy security for the world, that becomes a bigger theme. But I do think it all kind of rests under one large umbrella, which is, and I'm going to borrow Minister Tim Hodgson's line because it's really good, which is that Western LNG is representative of a golden opportunity for Canada in this moment to step up, be a player on the world stage, an energy provider, and also to support Canada's ambitions of being an energy superpower and diversifying our exports away from the United States. All at the same time, creating new opportunities and planting a seed of prosperity for nations in the North.
Absolutely. But those are the good messages. Let's talk about the other side of this kind of business.
Come on, Rebecca, give us some dirt.
We're going to go into, okay. You've been in the Premier's office. You've been on major projects, and as have we. And there's some opposition out there. We talked a little bit about it. There's some misinformation, and we've talked a little bit about this. I mean, in my experience, the opposition, some of it's legitimate, obviously concerns of the project. That's part of democracy, and every project can be improved. But there's elements of opposition that are just, frankly, and this is one of the reasons we do this podcast, is to dehumanize the people who are just trying to build things, and to, frankly, they are not held to the same accountability standards that you are.
No.
Right? A publicly traded company, for example, can't say certain things. Somebody like yourself,
a regulated company
can't say certain things. So you're held to a certain standard, but they're throwing shit and seeing what sticks.
Yes.
Right? So how did you handle that, and how do you continue to handle that? Because at a personal level, there's a lot of attempting to dehumanize and make people like yourself, and we've been in these projects in the past, something like the other, who aren't worthy of being treated as human beings, frankly.
Yep.
They try to do that.
Oh, yes. That is an absolute textbook tactic. And also, by the way, Bing, thank you for saying shit before I say it, because I'm going to say it now. One of my favorite quotes that I want tattooed on my arm is
we can do that here too.
Yeah. Bring out the tattoo machine. Let's do it live.
When you hear it, you'll think oh God, no. The effort to create, or the effort to refute bullshit, is an order of magnitude larger than that to create it. So true. And the thing is that you, as you said, Bing, I'm work for a regulated company. I'm held to account for what I say and what a company says publicly. And I'm working to try and correct or refute misinformation that is being generated by people who don't have that kind of accountability. So I've dealt with wild misinformation and rumors and accusations.
Come on, give us the best stuff. Come on.
The best one, and this is actually the first time that I've publicly addressed this, because it's so bad. The best one is not the best, the most ludicrous one is the idea that somehow Jeffrey Epstein is involved in our project, which I think stems from an inaccurate news article written years ago. One, it's absolutely not true. This organization that they say is an investor is not an investor. They're not an investor. So they've never called me to ask.
Right.
So there you
And then
go.
it just gets
There you have it.
requoted and requoted.
It just gets reused. But I mean, I haven't addressed it because it hasn't really been widely picked up. It's not. So you don't want to create. You don't want to give fuel
don't
to
wanna
the
feed the beast.
fire. Yeah,
You
exactly.
want to wrestle with the pig because sometimes the pig likes it.
Yeah, exactly. So no, it's not true. It's that is inaccurate. There's another one that people had a good chuckle about in our office that, well, Bing, we could pick up these floating LNG platforms and we could just move them somewhere else and leave the Niska and lurch, according to this ludicrous rumor. No, the industry doesn't work that way. You don't build LNG facilities to spec for, Canadian LNG with its particular, or not LNG, but Canadian inlet gas with a particular composition.
Sulfur content.
Exactly.
And all
It's got so much CO2 in it and so much methane in it, et cetera, et cetera. You
can't just buy one of these on Craigslist?
No, you can't just buy it on Craigslist and swap it with your neighbor. It doesn't work like that. It's, they're built to spec. And if in some alternate universe we wanted to do that, it would cost us billions of dollars to do it.
It
So
seems like a lot of money to spend just to,
why wouldn't you build a new one somewhere else if you wanted to? So, I mean, also another point to make there is we have 20-year sales contracts. We are bound by those contracts.
Right.
We will be delivering LNG for 20 years, and because we have buyers for it for 20 years. So it doesn't make sense.
I always think that in the same way, when people really come for you, you know that you're successful. Yeah. In the same way, the more ludicrous the accusations, I often think the project must be very strong, because when
they run out of legitimate things
and
to
people,
complain.
Yes, I mean, we've experienced that on wood fiber a lot with conspiracy theories around fire bombs and different environmental aspects that actually weren't true and couldn't be made possible.
Yeah.
And I just feel as though the more you get of that, the more strong the project is.
Yeah.
I would be remiss not to ask, though, on the negative side of media right now, Nisga'a, Great Nation, Partner Nation, how are things going with surrounding nations? Because the North Coast is a very politically complicated area. We see that with other things like the West Coast oil pipeline that's proposed by Alberta. So how is that going between the nation?
It's an important and beautiful part of the province, let's be honest.
Well, listen, I mean, when you first reached out to me, Ali, for this podcast, I said to you, let's wait and do this in June, because I'm pretty sure I'm going to have some news for you in June. So here we are, we're sitting on June 9th. And today we announced agreements with 3 nations for Salism's LNG, Lat-Kw'alaam, Metlakatla, and Gitga'la. We're also going to be announcing an agreement with the Gitga'at this week.
Wow.
So we will now have 5 out of 6 nations signed.
Congratulations.
Thank
Yeah,
you. That is,
awesome.
it is great. And those who have, been in the LNG space know that those nations are hard to convince. So, that's been a lot of work from the beginning with, senior project representatives sitting in offices in Prince Rupert and Port Edward, and really making an effort to build relationships. And so the relationships are good. The relationships are really good. We're very fortunate. We have more work to do. We have, a few more nations that we need to sign on the pipeline side. Mm-hmm. But, I think that this raises a really good thing to keep in mind, which is, yes, we're going to get opposition. It's you can't build a daycare in this province without somebody saying they don't want it. That's just the reality. We live in a democratic country with free speech. And people who don't like the project have every right to say that they don't like the project. We respect that. But I think one of the mistakes that I find myself correcting with media a lot is confusing a few individuals within a nation with nation leadership. And I think media should be a lot more careful with vetting the people that they talk to, the quote unquote opponents.
Who claim to speak particularly for a First Nation.
Particularly for a First Nation. And then, you also get media quoting analysts who are in fact 25-year-old career project opponents who glue themselves to roadways. So, these aren't industry analysts.
It's a niche career, but there are some doing it.
They shouldn't take,
Pavement blue person.
I end up talking a lot to journalists about, like, why are you listening to this person when they talk to you about the industry? Why would they know? And, you can sort of see the reporter say like, you're right. I should probably.
Those same journalists, I'm trying to talk away from oftentimes academics to a lawyer. Go talk to a project lawyer. Go talk to a lawyer who's actually working on this file instead of going to talk to someone who is very smart and a subject matter expert, but maybe hasn't actually worked in the sector in about 20 years.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And so, but I think maybe what it shows is it's becoming harder to find people who are, opposed to these projects for like really important reasons that Canadians care about. Maybe that's the case. The polling shows that support for LNG development is 60 plus 70% across Canada.
Once people get to know an industry, they start to become more comfortable.
They become more, yes. Once you know, I think you shine some light on it, and this is my whole philosophy. You shine light on your project and your people, like you are today, and you become, I think, as a member of the public, you can't help but feel better about it. Can't address every problem. Can't make everybody happy.
And things can always be improved upon.
Things can
there's nothing wrong
always
with
be
criticism.
improved. Yeah. Sometimes someone will say, hey, give constructive criticism. Why don't you consider this? Wood fiber, great example. Somebody said early on, could you please paint the facility green? Because, do you remember this, Allie? Could you paint the facility green? And it seemed like, because it will blend in better.
For the view from the
gondola. Yeah. And I remember being a part of that conversation, and the initial reaction was like, well, it is what it is, right? You put these things together and the paint's going to be what the paint's going to be. By the time I left the company, there was an active conversation happening about what shade of green it was going to be. I don't know if it's still going to be green, but I know that we had made progress on that request, right? So you try to address the problems and the concerns and requests that people make. Sometimes you can't. But you at least hear them out. And, most of the time when I listen to people's concerns, I at least have something to say to them about it. I had somebody come up to me not long ago up in the Nass Valley asking about why we'd moved an eagle's nest. How could you do that? How could you move an eagle's nest? And I said, oh, I know exactly what you're talking about. You're talking about there was no eagle in the eagle's nest. We waited for months to make sure that there was no eagle in the eagle's nest. And then we just moved the eagle's nest to a new tree. They thought we'd just ripped it down. So oftentimes it's that understanding and it's that connection over even a small point that can really clarify a concern and put people at ease.
Absolutely.
And so the opposition is going to happen. And some people are going to be opposed no matter what. And probably they don't even know anything about us. But we expect it. We plan for it. We expect it. It's going to happen, and that's okay.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
All these LNG projects had challenges. This one was supported by the Nisga'a Nation. Took a little while for the province to get on board. Suddenly the province was on board, and then took a little while for the feds to get on board. Now you're on the major project list.
Yeah.
Why was that? Why did it take that long from your perspective? Why can't the province and the feds seem to work together on things? This is probably translated to other projects in other sectors, but there's some thoughts about.
I think my opinion is that we were part of a geopolitical shift globally, but also in Canada, mostly in Canada, that happened almost immediately after Donald Trump announced tariffs against Canada. And, I think all of us watched that happen with disgust and real disappointment. And when Mark Carney became prime minister, or when he became leader of the party and was talking about diversifying away from the United States, making new friends overseas, making new trade connections, we are the biggest way for Canada to do that. I also recall a line from Premier Eby after he was elected, after the last provincial election. I think you might have been at this event. It was a Board of Trade event or something like that. And he said, coming that close to losing an election really clarifies the mind, crystallizes the mind. And there's a realization that it's all about the economy, that in a free and fair society like British Columbia and Canada, managing an economy is what government needs to do best. And so, they're we've got 2 new leaders who are thinking this way coming into office, and you've got a $30 billion project almost ready to go.
Trump moved that. I would say Trump moved that sort of EB, federal liberals or federal government, provincial government, moved that from sort of passive support to active support.
But can we be a little critical here? Sure. Because that is something that frustrates me, and we're often explaining it to some of our overseas clients, is Canada's not going to open its arms to you. They're not going to make it easy for you to do a big project here. But once your project gets further along, say has an EA certificate or, has showing some real momentum, then the BC and Canadian government will step up and give you some incentives. So I guess in your opinion, Rebecca, when do you think the provincial and federal government should be taking interest in these projects? Because if that geopolitical shift didn't happen, would you be in this position?
I think we would still be in this position because we have this project with sound fundamentals. Agreed. I think we'd still be here. I think what's changed is the level of vocal support that we get from both levels of government. I want to paraphrase my boss, the CEO of Western LNG. He says, and I've heard him say to American investors, I would rather do business in Canada any day of the week than do business in the United States. So much harder to get your approvals. You're going to be put through a real process, but once you've got them, you've got them. They're yours. You have permission to build.
You're not going to be back in court 10 minutes later.
You're not going to be back in court. And the other thing he really likes about Canada is there is no humming and hawing and no back and forth about where we stand on climate change, where we stand on Indigenous rights. These are accepted parts of the project. So when you come in to make a project, you know what the expectations are going to be. You know what you're going to have to show. If you can't put together a project that meets those expectations, don't bother. But I'm sure you advise your clients all the time. You're going to have this. You're going to have that. You're going to have Indigenous participation. You're going to have environmental mitigations. You try to be net zero. You can, try to reduce your land impacts. You're going to have to consult early. Mm-hmm. You're going to have to do these things. It's actually laid out in the process for you to make it easy. There's a pretty clear roadmap, but it's all worth it in the end because A, you've built a great project. You've designed a great project that will, exceed other countries' standards, and you'll have your permits. And you'll be able, you can move from there. You don't have to worry about them being taken away from you. Mm-hmm. So yeah, there's a beauty to doing business in Canada, and I actually wouldn't have it any other way. As a Canadian, I think it should be hard to get big, disruptive projects built here. I think you should have to show that you're the best you can possibly be and the value that you're offering to Canadians. I don't think that we should just put a industrial facility wherever we want. I think we can't lose sight in the importance of economic growth. We can't lose sight of the fact that we live in this amazing place, that we breathe pristine air, that we have fresh water. I think that's going to always be really important to us. So we have to meet those standards.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming on today. And thanks for sharing your exciting news about the new agreements with the Coast Swimpscott Nations. We know that's difficult. And as people that really support energy development in British Columbia and Canada, that's a big announcement today. So congratulations on that.
Let's build good projects,
people.
Let's
build, baby, build. Thanks again to everyone that listened to today's episode of Primary Risk featuring Rebecca Scott. Please follow us to receive notifications on upcoming episodes wherever you might get your podcast. Check out the show notes for references to the many materials that were mentioned during today's discussion, and new episodes will be released mostly monthly. Bing and I have been very busy this year, so I would say we're building British Columbia and Canada, but we do have another episode coming out after this featuring one of our good friends from Alberta, so stay tuned for that. And until next time, thank you again.
Thanks, Rebecca.